Hi, welcome to Rocky Mountain Ranch Research. I'm your host, Katie Paige, and on this episode, we will be visiting Medicine Bow National Forest. This is the site of the famous Carl Higdon case from October 25th, 1974. I think this case is very important for Rocky Mountain Ranch Research to take a look at, as it has some similarities to the events in Elbert County, Colorado from my childhood. It has an elk connection, these strange boxes, among other things. So I hope that you enjoy as you come along with us to the site of the Carl Higdon case.
We're within about a mile radius from where Carl Higdon had his encounter nearly 50 years ago. Almost to the day, really. This was October 25th, 1974. He parked off the side of the road here, walked in about a mile, picked up his 7mm new rifle, which was his pride and joy, and he saw 5 elk in the meadow, and he fired off a shot. He knew something was wrong almost immediately, as if the shell of the bullet exited to the right in slow motion, and then the bullet hit like an invisible wall or an invisible box and seemed to fall to the ground. At that time, Carl sees what he describes as the brightest light he's ever seen, and he's squinting his eyes, and his eyes are watering and burning, and he sees an extraterrestrial. He said it was about the same height as him, about 6'2", had human-looking features, but it had these appendages instead of hands. And telepathically, the being says to Carl, "Are you hungry?" And he floats these pills, I believe 4 or 5 pills, over to Carl. Carl takes one of these pills. I find this case interesting for several reasons in connection to the Rocky Mountain Ranch. First of all, of course, the year 1974, where the encounter at Rocky Mountain Ranch from my childhood was 1975 to 1978. But we also have this strange, unusual box involved. In going through the Dr. Leo Sprinkle files at the Heritage Center in Laramie, Wyoming, a lot of the original documentation about this case is there, from medical records to photographs. They even photographed what looks like an imprint of a box on the ground. So he left Rawlins, Wyoming. It was around 3 p.m., gets out here around 4 o'clock. 5:30 is about the time he has his encounter, and by 8:30 that evening, his wife is getting concerned because Carl has not returned home yet. Carl and his wife had 7 children, so I can imagine he's out here hunting elk so they have a nice freezer full of meat for the winter. So she's concerned and calls the boss, and actually Carl ends up very disoriented, calls his boss from the truck. They end up finding his truck a couple miles away from where he had originally parked his vehicle. In fact, the truck was in this muddy bog, and it took several vehicles to get his truck out of there. They found Carl with red, watery eyes, saying his shoulder hurt, screaming about the elk, "My elk, they took my elk." And they took him immediately to receive medical treatment. And he indeed was in the hospital for over 2 days. Dr. Leo Sprinkle was heavily involved in this case, which is also very cool for me because of Dr. Leo Sprinkle's involvement with the Rocky Mountain Ranch and APRO too at the time. And I like this case because we have several photographs. They did recover the shell of that 7mm rifle that was turned inside out. They have that imprint on the ground. There was a strange carving in one of these aspen trees. And one thing I was really interested in, I think it's important to actually come and visit these locations. In the nearly 40-mile drive up to this location, it was pretty open plains with very sparse pockets of aspens and ponderosas, very similar to the Elbert County Rocky Mountain Ranch area. But as we got within a couple miles of this actual site of the Carl Higdon case, it really got dense. And if you can look over here where we pan, it really reminds me of the interview we just did with the elk hunter, and where he had an encounter near the Palmer Divide in Elbert County, where he saw an orange glow and a hovering craft. And the terrain is very similar to this. And I think as we go back and even look at historical cases, it's important to look at the geological makeup, whether there's water features, whether there's aquifers underground. Even knowing that there's a lot of aspen trees and ponderosa pines out here, very similar to the Elbert County area. the elk connection, the deer connection, the cattle. There's cattle just right over the ridge here. So all things are kind of connecting the dots for me, and that's why I'm out here doing this, trying to look at, what was the box. Carl talks about also one kind of floated him, and he couldn't figure out how to get into the box. So also one, which is the name of this guy here, gets him in the box, and Carl says that the inside of this box was much bigger inside than when it appeared outside. In fact, there were other beings, or his compadres, in the craft, as well as the 5 elk. They take him to his planet, where they see this big obelisk shaped thing like a Tesla tower. And he goes into this. Also, one floats him over to the Tesla tower, and they scan his body, and they convey to him, "You are not what we're looking for." So they return him back, albeit they have the truck in the wrong place in this mud bog, but they return him back to Earth. And kind of later, he kind of goes, "Oh, I had a vasectomy. Perhaps maybe that's why they returned me." So again, very interesting. And the amount of physical evidence in this case makes it compelling. Also, the multiple witnesses, when they were out searching for Carl that night, his wife, along with others in the search party, saw a white, red, blue, and green craft in the sky that night, very similar to what is seen out there at Rocky Mountain Ranch around those same years. Also a really interesting connection in that regard. Also, one was also very fascinated with Carl's gun and says to him, "I wish I could keep this. It's such a nice antique." And Carl's thinking, "This is a brand new gun in my pride and joy. What do you mean an antique?" So that was an interesting little detail right there. I think it's interesting. I know it's been over 50 years, and people might ask, why are you out here? And sometimes they feel like, oh my gosh, there's nobody within miles. But I think it's important to actually visit the locations and to look for the commonalities and the similarities to the Rocky Mountain Ranch region. There's several very compelling things about this case in particular, that some we mentioned before, the years, but I also like to look at the geology of the location, the types of trees, the types of minerals. What are the color configurations of the craft scene that night that the search party witnessed, and is it similar to what was seen at that time in Rocky Mountain Ranch? There's so many correlations that can be made. Military bases that are nearby, perhaps. We have Francis E. Warren out of Cheyenne nearby. All of these things are important components in the reason why I'm here doing this work. And I can tell you, the feeling out here is almost identical as if I was standing at the Rocky Mountain Ranch. It gives me goosebumps, actually. It's just so compelling to me. And I'm really glad that I came out here to really look at this case and get to know it better. Thank you for coming along with me as we look at this site and the Carl Higdon case.
And don't forget, it's never too early to start that Christmas shopping. Rocky Mountain Ranch Research just added some really cool new products to their store. If you click on the link below, you can check them out. We have some really cool oversized coffee mugs, wine glasses, exclusive Alien Tubby Guy t-shirts, hoodies, and much more. So I hope that you'll help us in supporting what we do here to bring this content to you. Thank you in advance.